Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. In this episode, our subject is Uncontrollable, the Threat of Artificial Superintelligence and the Race to Save the World. That's a new book on a vitally important subject. The book's front cover carries this endorsement from Professor Max Tegmark of MIT, a captivating, balanced and remarkably up-to-date book on the most important issue of our time. There's also high praise from William MacAskill, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford. The most accessible and engaging introduction to the risks of AI that I've read. Calum and I have lots of questions ready to put to the book's author, Darren McKee, who joins us today from Ottawa in Canada. Darren, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Darren.
Darren, what should our listeners know about your background?
Well, academically, I did a master's in experimental psychology, as well as one in public administration. I've been a policy analyst for many, many years, but also a very curious person. I have a science and critical thinking podcast called The Reality Check. We've done that for about 15 years, almost 700 episodes, a wide range of topics, myth-busting, truth behind the headlines, fighting misinformation and disinformation, but also just a very, as I said, curious person, having a podcast before everyone did. So when you read, say on average, a nonfiction book every week for about 20 years, you come to learn a lot about the world and how different pieces relate or don't. And I think that wide background helped me prepare for writing this book.
Did that background lead you naturally into the field of artificial intelligence and the risks that might be involved?
Well, certainly I've always been interested in science in general, and then technology in particular, and AI. Well, it captures the imagination when you're younger, whether it's some sci-fi thing or some interesting philosophical experiment. But I think in the 90s, 2000s, people started to care more about it. I remember Kurzweil's Singularity is Near. I think that was 2005 or 2006. And that seemed very interesting and complicated and important. And I remember even back in, say, 2007, 2008, I already started to be concerned about automation and whether there'd be employment issues for humans as AI advanced further. And then as we sort of progressed in the 2010s, Bostrom's Superintelligence coming out in 2014, which really made a compelling argument in my mind, or at least put together stuff that I largely agreed with, and then he really reinforced it. And since that time, the AI issue has just grown and grown, and especially in the past few years. And so for the book itself, I saw that the capabilities of AI systems were really surpassing the public's understanding of them. And it was around June 2022 when I thought, okay, I should get involved. I should try to contribute to this problem or this issue. Before that, I thought, well, other people are already on it. I'm not a technical AI researcher, so it's not really my place. And then I came to see it as, okay, we need as many hands on this issue as possible. We can all try to pitch in and help. And I thought I could perhaps fill a gap, which was a beginner-friendly, introductory, accessible book about AI risk or AI safety that's accessible for everyone. You don't need any technical background or science background, and it seems well received so far.
You mentioned science fiction. The cover of your book might look like the cover of a science fiction book. It's got the world covered in flames. How do you answer the criticism, which we often hear, that all this talk about existential risk from AI is unfounded, it's just fictitious?
I think there's a couple ways to tackle that. So I usually like to take a big, broad step back and think about, say, human history and human progress. To get to the ending first, we are living in a previous generation's idea of science fiction. So if you look at the broad scope of humanity, we are surrounded by objects, paraphernalia, human creations that didn't exist for most of human history. And from the fantastical, like we're doing a podcast and there's a very complicated electronic equipment that allows this to occur, to the very basics of like using a knife. That's one of the examples in the book. Have you ever used a knife? And it seems ridiculous, but for a lot of human history, we didn't have knives. Plastic knives, metal knives, any sort of knives. Yes, there were sharp objects people used, but the creation of a knife itself is a really remarkable human achievement, let alone a car or a computer or anything else. So if you go back in time, objects that we have now are not only a bit science fiction-y. If you go further back, I think they're actually unthinkable. People wouldn't have the conceptual apparatus to even consider the idea of the thing. Where you're trying to get to the moon, and it's, say 10,000 years ago, You wouldn't think I need a certain type of rocket. You just wouldn't even have the idea of a rocket. I think that would be likely in that case. So when people say it's science fiction, I first want to address, what exactly do they mean? Do they mean it might not exist for 10 or 20 years? Do they actually mean it's impossible, which is an interesting claim to make against the laws of physics, given how much human progress has occurred in the past 20 or 30 years? Or do they mean something else?
Well, I think the criticism comes down to we don't think AI is actually going to want to do any of these bad things. Why would an AI want to set the world on fire?
I think that's a very important and reasonable question. I'd sort of take it in two stages again. So one is the broader question of, if that's the specific concern, how confident is someone in that? Are they sure? Are they so sure they're willing to bet everyone's lives on it? Is there a chance that it could? And given that if you talk to leading researchers, they say, we don't really know how these systems work. The researchers who put out these products are often surprised at how capable they are. I believe OpenAI, when they released ChatGPT, they were not expecting it to be so powerful, so influential, and so important to so many people. So that's not a reassuring sign when the very people who are making the products are a bit surprised at how capable they are. And then to the specific question, well, there are a variety of ways in which an AI system may inadvertently, through accident, cause harm, where we've sort of underspecified what we want it to do, and it does the thing we want in the wrong way. One of the examples is an algorithm was asked to play Tetris and to not lose, and it just paused the game indefinitely. Now, you almost want to give it points for creativity, but that's not really what the researchers meant. But of course, the system is not being devious at that stage. It's just finding the simplest path to execute something. With a human parallel, usually there's more, we'll sometimes say, intent involved, when lawyers or other people might try to circumvent laws to achieve their goals versus the intended goals. But pervasive incentives happen frequently. But for AI systems, there could be systems where A, humans are using them to misuse against other people to cause harm, and B, the systems themselves could engage in what we call power-seeking behavior. These things have already been demonstrated in the lab in sort of simulated play settings when GPT-4 was tested. Now, when it was being tested, GPT-4 was not connected to the internet. There were researchers acting as intermediaries. But the system was able to hire a human to fill out a CAPTCHA, meaning one of these things that's supposed to prevent AI or robot systems from accessing websites, by asking a human to do it and then tricking the human and lying about why it did it. So that has already been demonstrated on models that have existed. Now, they tweaked it, of course, so that couldn't happen. And there's other examples like this where there's deception. These systems are already very good at strategic thinking and planning. AI is the best at poker. It's great at other board games that involve strategy, deception, and so on. So if you look at the trend line, I think there are good reasons to be concerned. Again, it's not 100% concern, but all you need is a 1, 5, 10, 20% concern to think we should really be doing something about this to ensure that we're going to be safe.
I'm going to confess at this stage that Calum and I share with you the view that attempting to control a superintelligent AI to avoid the kinds of mishaps you've described, that's a really tough task. Might even be impossible. Where we're not so sure and where we really welcome your ideas is, well, what can we do to avoid this kind of problem?
I think we need a variety of approaches. In the book, I talk about 8 broad proposals at different levels. I think there's a way for everyone or all different levels of society to contribute. I first start with 3 broad principles. Principle 1 is having verification. This is kind of obvious in hindsight, but we have to ensure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, or even what they say they're doing, and verified. We can't trust them entirely. Yes, it would be nice if we lived in a world where you could trust people to do exactly what they say, but we know from history and common examples that that's not quite the case. There needs to be oversight, meaningful oversight. The second principle is agility and adaptability. This is both in a practical sense, so laws or regulations could be updated more frequently than they usually are, but also can we have people try to mentally and emotionally prepare for rapid change more so than they already are? I know it's very difficult. Things are very disruptive. It can be hard to get a handle on life and the world, but this is probably par for the course and it's only going to increase. So are there ways in which people can sort of emotionally sit with this stuff as it's changing so they're more and more prepared? And the third one, which is maybe most practical for your question, is something called defense in depth. And this is borrowed from the world of cybersecurity. In this context, we're trying to think of how to solve a problem. There may be a problem, how do we address it? And we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. So defense in depth is the principle of having multiple lines of defense and not expecting any one to succeed, and perhaps even expecting them to fail to have a more robust and resilient system.
On that verification idea, how are we going to enforce that countries outside the democratic system, countries who regard themselves as different, that they are going to submit their own AI for such verification? I've been listening to another podcast in the last week, Lazarus Heist, about the North Korean Lazarus group. They're very skilled, the hackers there, but they're not submitting their designs to any Western agency for verification before they attempt to amass a fortune by ransomware or similar means. So how is this verification going to work in the real world?
Yes, it's always a perennial problem when you have great ideas and then in practice the complexity and the different incentives by different actors, including states. This is where the defense in depth, where you might not be able to fully verify, say, some aspects of the models, but then you could use a different approach, perhaps compute governance. This is the idea of having a greater regulation and understanding of where the computer chips that go into these systems, where they're going, who has them, and how powerful they are. It just so happens that this is perhaps one of the best bottlenecks or choke points at the moment. Maybe that's going to change in the next several years. But at the moment, it's not like every country makes these chips or even designs them. They're really thought up, or so to speak, or strategized or planned and designed in one place. And they're made largely in Taiwan. So at the moment, at least, society, the world, can get a sense of who has what chips and to what extent. And for the models that we're most concerned about, usually they require thousands and thousands of very powerful chips. In that way, while, yes, North Korea is not going to submit some sort of AI model for review, or they're not going to be subject to liability in the same way a North American or Western company might be, you could use aspects of compute governance.
But as you say, at the moment, you could spot a GPU farm which is being used to create a new large language model. You could probably spot it from space. In 10 years' time, it will fit on a teenager's computer. And so the defense in depth gets a lot harder then, doesn't it?
Well, certainly. The way I understand it is what I'm proposing are what I think are good ideas that should be studied extensively and see what the best options or versions of them are. And those should also, again, to that principle of agility and adaptability, change over time. If something seems like it's not being useful, or it may be in theory useful but not in practice useful, then we should get rid of that and try something else. Being super open-minded about what might work, and if there are better approaches that balance, we'll say, geopolitical strategic interests as well as power structures that would be more amenable to creating safe AI, then we should pursue those sorts of things. But yes, I am also concerned where people will say, well, yeah, look at this. We only need regulation for a certain level of powerful computer. I think the Biden White House executive order might have said 10 to the 26 flops, which is just a number of computational processing speed. Well, over time, models will surpass that for sure, but they will also be just as powerful being much under that number. This is where people may not realize they're going to have to both increase their expectations of what's going to happen, as well as decrease the number to maintain a consistent level of power regulation.
Yeah. One of the problems with getting a really concerted regulatory framework in place is there's an awful lot of debate about whether one is needed. Many of the leading lights, or some of these sort of leading lights of AI, vigorously reject the idea that one is needed. Two of the standard bearers are obviously Yann LeCun, who is one of the three founders, if you like, of the field of deep learning and has for many years headed up Meta's AI lab. And another one is Andrew Ng of Coursera and Baidu. Yann LeCun says that there's no way that we're going to be stupid enough or unlucky enough to invent machines which will want to destroy us. And he says that intelligence doesn't necessarily give you a drive to power. If it did, then Einstein would have ruled the world, and he didn't. That's his latest argument. Andrew Ng, famous for the comment that worrying about superintelligence is like worrying about overcrowding on Mars. And more recently, he said that he's tried quite hard to get GPT-4 to give him a recipe to destroy mankind, and it simply won't do it. So he's quite relaxed. Now, it's tough to argue with these guys because they know what they're talking about. They're very smart, and they are extremely stubborn. But without people like that agreeing that superintelligence is a serious challenge and a serious risk in the coming years, it's tough to get the whole of the human race on board with it. Most people hearing about superintelligence, hearing about really advanced AI, they sort of feel vaguely nervous about it and on the whole would rather it went away. But They don't understand it well enough to have a formed view. And when you've got quite a lot of the AI community saying, hey, there's nothing to worry about here, look over there, it's tough to get a powerfully mobilized political force behind the idea of strongly regulating, or at least supervising, development of advanced AI. Have you got any thoughts about how to win those people over?
You're right, it is a tricky and delicate subject. I sort of see it as different arguments work for different people. What might work in one setting or for one audience doesn't work for another. And as you said, some people are harder to reach than others. If we're playing the deference to authority game, because Jan LeCun is one of the three founding godfathers along with Joshua Bengio and Geoffrey Hinton, then we can say, well, the other two are very concerned. So much so that they're dedicating a lot of their life to ensuring that other people understand that AI is a risk. And then you have this weird, like, well, 2 out of 3 dentists, 2 out of 3 AI researchers think that AI might kill you. What do you do with that? The famous people don't agree. What do we do about that? And I would say in almost any other context, you would be more prudent. You'd be more risk cautious. If you were going to have a meal at a nice restaurant and like, oh, there's 3 chefs that work here. One chef says your food's fine. The other 2 say it might poison you and kill you. You wouldn't eat there. It's so ridiculous. And yet in this context, sometimes we can't help but think that way. I think as a whole, the general populace is more concerned than some AI experts. If you look at surveys, there's 60, 70% agreement on we shouldn't build superintelligence at all. We shouldn't build it unless we can control it. We should be very concerned about runaway accelerationism. There's this interesting or quirky distribution of who might be concerned and for what reasons. So for people who saw maybe one of the Terminator movies 3 decades ago, they just believe it's a problem. They don't necessarily have reasons. They don't necessarily need more reasons. But for people who do want reasons, I would say look at what Jan LeCun says, separate from him being the person who says it, and is he providing a good argument? And what exactly is the argument? The argument seems to be, at least in the one you reference, is that we're going to figure it out, and don't worry, it can't happen. Well, that's not that reassuring for anyone who's even a little bit concerned or looks at human history, because we do often figure things out. That's great. Hopefully we'll make advances in AI safety. But to bet perhaps widespread displacement of humanity on the idea that we're just going to figure it out, that's not reassuring. I would rather take a more cautious approach and have everything work out just fine and be shown to be maybe wrong in hindsight. If you do the sort of risk calculus, would you rather be under or over prepared? That's one way of looking at it. And then for a lot of these other arguments, they just don't make a lot of sense to me. Like most things have not been safe by default. When cars were first created, someone walked in front of them holding a flag, right? So the cars obviously didn't go that fast. And then humanity decided, no, we want the functionality. So we're going to get rid of that person walking in front. And then cars were more dangerous. And then over time, you have seatbelts, you have anti-lock brakes, you have airbags, you have all these things. And it took a long time for cars to become safer. And they still kill a lot of people. With AI or super powerful AI, we may have to get it right the first time, or within a multi-year span, and not instead of a multi-decade span. So when I hear some of these arguments, I guess it's worthwhile for some in the community to fully engage these people, so those arguments are addressed. At the same time, I don't really expect to reach everyone. You just can't do that, I think, practically speaking.
But my point is that in order to have a thoroughgoing supervisory, precautionary approach, we really need most people, most humans on board, because we're going to have to sacrifice a lot to have that. In order to do that, you've got to get the siren voices saying there's nothing to worry about. And there's a lot of them. You've got to persuade them, actually, we do need to be more cautious.
I guess I'm just trying to be realistic. I think we should try to persuade them. I just think there should be multiple plans in place for people who just seem like they won't be convinced whatsoever. Or, to be frank, there are people who research these products who also think these AI systems, more advanced ones, could kill everyone. They just think that's worth it. They think, well, I'm going to die someday with 100% likelihood. AI systems might stave off death. So even if there was a 90% chance of AI killing everyone, it's still worth the trade. I don't think this is a good argument, but people actually believe this. And other researchers think, well, in terms of the evolution of intelligence of the history of the world, we're going to be displaced. Humans have had our time, and it's time to give way to the AI as a successor species. Most people wouldn't agree with that at all. So perhaps it is highlighting some of the beliefs that researchers actually have, highlighting the poor arguments that I say that people are making, sincerely addressing the core issues. But I mean, if you're thinking tactily, it's trying to relate to someone. What is the crux of the matter? I think that's if you're having any sort of reasonable argument and debate, or hopefully discussion, as opposed to just an argument, it can be like, what is the core issue? Is it really that, say, Jan LeCun has a completely different risk profile? Does he have a completely different world model? For some of the exchanges that I've seen, again, not extensive, I haven't seen the detail or the rigor that makes me fully understand his arguments in a way that I find convincing at all. If anything, it makes it seem less convincing. I feel like his arguments are doing worse to justify his own stance sometimes.
There is an argument that there are more important people to persuade than all the tech leaders, and that's the politicians. That if the politicians really decide this is an important issue, they can put regulations in place which will compel the AI companies to do various things. In the last few months, we've seen a lot more politicians speak about the risks of AI. And one thing about your book that really impressed me is somehow, despite the book coming out in November, you managed to address some of the issues at the event in the beginning of November at Bletchley Park. We've had a few months since then to think about things. Are you encouraged by what politicians are saying, or is there a risk that they've now moved on to something else and AI governance is going to go back to its default, not in place state?
That's a very good, nuanced question. So I think I'll say that I have been encouraged, and then it's a bit of a wait and see. The world really onboarded the idea of AI capabilities being a danger or a risk or safety, much more so than I think a lot of people in the community anticipated. 2023 was a bit of the year of AI, but also happily was a bit of the year of AI safety. From Geoffrey Hinton resigning to the Future of Life Institute's pause letter that came out that so many people signed, to that statement by the Center for AI Safety that said AI systems are an extinction level threat and should be treated and addressed much like nuclear war or pandemics. So many people signed that statement. This goes to the previous comment about Jan LeCun or others. When you have the CEOs of the leading companies saying that their system might cause extinction, and you have Bill Gates, and you have Daniel Dennett and David Chalmers who agree on this, which is nice, it seems like, well, so many different people think this is a big problem, including the people who are building it. Surely that's of concern. All of that being in the public space is important. If you can get people to listen to what the people building these systems actually say, that's important, because they really do warn about humanity having severe problems or lights out for humanity or disempowerment. Dario Amodei, who's the head of Anthropic, said there's a 10 to 25% chance of extinction. People just may not believe them when they hear these things. In the book, I try to disentangle why it seems like they're probably sincere versus not. But to your point, the safety summit happening at all was significant to me. The Biden White House putting the executive order out when they did was significant to me. The EU AI Act debates, having these discussions about whether to have general purpose systems, all these things were very encouraging. I guess it kind of depended on what your world model was before that. I think 2024, we'll see what actually gets implemented, what progress is made in other countries regarding these regulations and states, and will the Americans move forward on putting something more in regulatory legal space versus just an executive order, which has some power but not as much teeth.
There's supposed to be a follow-up to the Bletchley Park Summit, and I think the first one was going to be South Korea and then France, or maybe it's the other way around. Do you know when they are going to happen and have they been confirmed?
I don't, but I thought the South Korea was 6 months and then France was 6 months after that.
Yeah.
There's a longer term question. Some people say we might manage to control AI for a while, but sooner or later, AI is going to be so powerful. So in the end, we've got to give up controlling it, and we've got to hope that we can align it. In other words, that we can design what will become super powerful AI in a way that it respects human well-being. So what are your views on the possibility of solving this alignment problem?
I think it's necessary that we try, but I'm intermittently optimistic. Why don't I put it that way? I think it depends how one might define this type of thing. Right now, we're working to have systems better align with our goals. Clearly, when these AI systems, whether it's GPT-4 or Gemini or Meta's Llama or whatever it may be, are released into the world, most of these companies are very concerned that the systems don't say overtly racist or sexist or problematic things, or reveal personal information. Of course, they seem to easily be able to do these things if someone prompts them the right way, puts the right words in. So there's already an arms race, so to speak, between people trying to make these systems safe to their standards and humans trying to hack or circumvent or subvert these processes.
Jailbreak them.
Yes, exactly. And then there's a whole other category where you have, say, other systems like Mistral that aren't as concerned about safety. You can use it however you want. And then it goes even further to terrible things on dark web or other places where you have different types of pornography. You can take someone's face, put it on someone else's body, or AI generate a body, and that creates anything you want pretty much. The complications and the problems here are pretty obvious, and I think society would need to act right now. I really just think people aren't prepared for the deep fake problems that are happening now, let alone what are going to happen in the next year or even in the coming years. So the alignment problem of does the AI system do what we want it to do? And then the other broader, almost philosophical, since the beginning of humanity problem, like who's we and what are our values and that sort of thing. We can't quite solve all of human ethics and morality in the next couple of years, but hopefully we can come to some sort of broad, pseudo-democratic sense of, well, people don't want child pornography, people don't want racist stuff, people don't want sexist things, people don't want, here's how you easily build weapons and bombs and so on. And that I would consider a win. I think it's going to be very difficult for a couple of reasons. One is that to try to assess how these systems are aligned or not, whatever you've learned from one model isn't necessarily applicable to the next generation. As well, the technology has this complication where we don't really understand how it works. I think that's still surprising to a lot of people because it seems like, well, these people are paid a lot of money. They know their computers. They've done the math. They have the physical thing in some sense, right? A physical computer is doing all the stuff somewhere in a database or a server. And yet, because of how they work, we don't really know what they do. Not entirely, because I don't want to mislead people, but the analogy might be that they're more grown than they are built, or as opposed to a gardener that has an advanced degree in biology and understands all the flowers, you just have a very sophisticated gardener that doesn't have the biological knowledge but knows how to cultivate different types of flowers to make a beautiful garden. And without the detailed understanding, we then run these risks of maybe there's an asterisk somewhere, maybe there's a loophole, maybe there's something we haven't thought of. And it seems for all these systems, if you just keep playing with them, more and more problems are revealed. I think just recently, if you input the word poem just repeatedly, it started to give back private information, someone's phone number, someone's address. Why would that be? Because that doesn't seem to make sense. And, if you're talking to a human and it's like, yeah, give me someone's phone number, you're like, I won't give it to you, and you repeated poem to them 50 times, that's not going to crack them. They're not going to break down under the severe pressure. And yet...
I don't know. I don't like poetry.
Yeah, exactly.
It would have an impact on me.
Poem, neat, right? Then you're like, oh, I'll give up, yes. It just shows how weird or foreign, or sometimes you use an alien, to describe how these things work. The concern on my end and many people's is that it may seem like an AI system is fully aligned with what you want, but you don't quite know. And there's always a risk that it isn't. And that's one stage, which is that you get these little problems where it reveals information, or maybe it does something problematic. Or if the system is more and more advanced, perhaps is engaging in some sort of manipulation or deception all along. That seems a bit harder for people to onboard, but as systems get more and more capable, it just seems to become more and more obvious. I've kind of learned that, unfortunately, something has to almost happen for people to believe it's possible. You can try to give them the heads up, but once it's actually happened, it's harder to dispute.
Can you point to examples of good things happening?
Oh, sure.
More generally, what are the bases you can offer people for optimism and hope rather than, gosh, this system's impossible?
Why my book mainly focuses on negative and risk is because the good things kind of sell themselves. There's enough marketers and companies in this world that will say we have a new AI product. People like using the products. They are amazing. From the very basic of, if you're not that good at art, now you can create art. This is amazing. If you like to play around with poetry, whatnot, you can have this system help you generate poetry. If you need some writing help, this can help you do that. So there's this huge empowerment and enablement that occurs with these AI systems that will help many people do many, many different things. And that shouldn't be undervalued. But because I think that's so wonderful and obvious, I haven't spent as much time on that.
But the question is not what wonderful things might happen with AI if we get it right, but how do we have a hope of getting it right?
Yes. In that sense, I think because everyone's starting to care a bit more, this provides me with some glimmers of hope. Like we're having this discussion now. There's many, many discussions. As I said, all the movement last year and into this year, people are very concerned. For me, I also take a step like, well, how can we have hope in general? It's easy to fall into despair, and I think it's very important not to. If you're trying to solve any problem, feeling like you can't solve it is not going to be effective. Take a step back. Is a problem solvable or not? Well, we don't quite know. Unsolved does not mean unsolvable, and we don't know. So there is possibility that we will be able to figure this out, and I take solace in that. And if we believe it is possible, we're more likely to find it if we're looking. So I think you can't easily rationalize yourself into hopefulness, but I think you can rationalize yourself away from hopelessness.
That's nicely put. Let's put you on the skewer with a couple of specific questions. What's your timeline and what's your pre-doom? How long do you think it will be before superintelligence arrives? And let's not worry too much about the definition of that. And what do you think is the likelihood that it would exterminate us one way or another?
Sure. Well, I do think definitions matter. So in my book, the superintelligence definition is human expert level or above, even way above. So I think that is plausible within several years, but I think that's happening within 10 years, if I had to put like a greater than 50% probability.
Wow.
Well, it's sort of like, how general does something have to be? We already have the narrow successes in many, many different human enterprises and games. And if you also look at the broad breadth of humanity, not everyone has had the educational opportunities or life course development and so on. So AI systems are already capable, more capable than many, many people. Now, this is for intellectual tasks, I want to clarify. There's huge advancements in robotics, and I think there'll be more to come. But having someone cut your hair is a lot harder than writing an essay on haircutting. As for the so-called probability of doom, I put it at least 10%. I have a huge range of error bars, and it could be 10%, it could be 50%. It kind of depends on the mood. But I think, what's the minimum threshold to then take dramatic action? And for me, 10% is enough. Now, if someone thinks a 10% probability of an AI displacing humanity or killing billions of people doesn't seem to be high enough, then for them, I might try to have that discussion and see what they mean, and then maybe it's 50% for that type of person. But for me, 10% risk of dramatic harm is very high. It's very concerning. And in many other policy, government, society spaces, a 1 or 3% risk of something requires dramatic action.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? We have these discussions about extinction and 10% chance of extinction within a decade. If this was anything else, if it was nuclear weapons, if it was sewage, if it was malnutrition, this would be causing a huge uproar. Yet it's almost like a parlor game. It's almost like a conversation you have on the salons, not in the pubs, if you like. It's a continual source of amazement to me, actually. I've been thinking about this sort of thing since Kurzweil's previous book, Spiritual Machines, in 1999. And I've been amazed ever since then that more people aren't interested in this, and I continue to be amazed.
I share the same sentiment, and I try to think of how to reach these people, how to communicate, how to have a shared world model or a shared reality, so to speak. And so the analogies. If a pharmaceutical company said, oh yeah, there's a 10% chance our new drug might kill everyone. What? Like, immediate uproar, right? People are very concerned about climate change, and I think they should be. Most climate experts do not think there's a 10% chance of billions of people dying in the next 10 years. Not at all. Maybe not even the next 50. Things get really bad in about 2100. Now, things are bad now, of course, for some people, but if you think of what are the actual risks and what are the likelihoods and so on, that seems to motivate more action, despite being perhaps less of a near-term problem in the next 5-10 years.
So you've said that if there is a 10% risk of a huge catastrophe, we should take drastic action. So your drastic action has included writing this book, which I want to commend because I found it a very accessible and engaging introduction. It punctures lots of the bogus answers that some people give as to why we shouldn't take it seriously. So you've written a book. What else do you think you should be doing? What do you think the rest of us should be doing to stop that 10% chance from coming to reality?
I think it depends on who you are, your interests, your skills, and in a way, your availability. I wrote a book because I thought I might be able to do that type of thing. And thank you for that compliments. It seems to be well received. I also knew that I couldn't write a technical AI safety book in great detail. That wouldn't be within my skill set in a certain amount of time. I think my role at the moment is trying to raise awareness of these issues to get people more aware of the risks, to understand the arguments in more detail so they can either figure out the issue for themselves, or if they encounter bad arguments, or what I might consider bad arguments, they can interrogate them and then see what they think for themselves. Depending on who you are, you could talk to your political representative and simply ask, how are you going to ensure that I am safe from AI systems as they develop? And make sure you get a really specific answer. As we know, the political levers are the ones that are often most important, and people will happily listen to a 2-hour podcast about these issues, but not spend 5 minutes contacting the representative. So I encourage everyone, if they're concerned, to do that sort of thing. There's raising awareness with friends and family. You could be donating to AI safety organizations. You could be volunteering. Just trying to raise awareness and understand more and more about the issue as this thing rapidly develops, and to ensure that we have safe AI innovation.
Presumably, since you think that superintelligence will arrive within 10 years and There's a 10% or more probability of extinction when it does. Presumably, you think we should stop developing advanced AI right now, don't you? Wouldn't you like to see a permanent moratorium until we work out AI alignment?
Well, I think there's the theoretical and then the possible. I think the idea of a permanent moratorium is so unlikely, I don't advocate for it in the book. AI is going to develop in many, many different places. We want good, safe AI. That's what we actually want. We want humans to be safe. A moratorium, I'm not quite sure how it would work or how it would be enforced in a way that overall leads to more safety.
Well, it would be an enhanced version of what's in the presidential directive. It would be, don't build any systems capable of more than this amount of processing, and if you do, we'll blow it up.
Well, that we're going to blow it up. Does it actually overall increase safety or not? And that's where I have a lot of uncertainties. Say in a different country, North Korea or something says they're not going to do it. Then are we going to risk a nuclear war over these types of things?
At the moment, North Korea isn't capable of building such a thing.
Correct.
And actually, if we stop anybody in the West and the places where it is possible to do it, if we stop anybody there doing it, then it'll be a long time before Russia and North Korea were able to. So if you really take seriously your argument, and I do take it quite seriously, within 10 years, 10% doom, I think that's plausible. In which case, I don't see how you avoid the conclusion, stop right now, which is kind of the common sense reaction that I get from most people. It's just that they don't take it very seriously. And going back to what I said before, I think part of the reason they don't take it seriously is somewhere between 25% and half of the AI community is saying this is all a lot of hogwash and superintelligence is a bogeyman. Some people even think superintelligence is a bogeyman invented by Sam Altman and other people to evade regulation about short-term AI risks like privacy and bias.
Yes. The regulatory capture argument is often used. I'm sympathetic in the sense of corporations will usually try to accumulate power for themselves. But my line in that is that I think the AI companies don't have to say our products could kill everyone. They could have just said it's a bit dangerous without saying the whole extinction level threats.
Yeah, it's a nonsensical argument.
But to your point, I don't have 100% confidence about all of this. But at the moment, I think strategically, the idea of pursuing a moratorium is less likely to enable safe AI innovation than the proposals in the book. Now, if companies and governments actually pursue the proposals, would there kind of de facto be a moratorium? Because some of these things are quite stringent. There's liability, there's detailed oversight, there's assessments not only during deployment, but during training and before deployment. And there can be enough rigor in place that it's a very high bar to be able to develop these things.
Ah, okay. So you're going for moratorium by stealth.
No, I'm going for safe AI innovation because currently AI is a consumer product, not seen as a weapon. And until that changes, I think it's going to be harder to make that argument in a convincing way to numerous policymakers. And you said maybe North Korea and Russia aren't close, but China's not that far behind. Would the US be risking other types of conflict with China to pursue this in the next, say, 1 to 5 years?
China's not far behind, but China's regulating large language models much more strictly than the West is.
Yes.
Because China does not want minds it can't control.
Yes, they sure are, but they're mainly regulating it for the general public, and it's not clear what they're doing militarily. Now, of course, no military wants a system that they can't control, so we might kind of luck into this sort of alignment by default, because people clearly see you can't have an AI system that doesn't do what you want to do if you're trying to protect yourself or harm an enemy. But at this particular moment, I'm saying the moratorium, I'm fully sympathetic. It makes a lot of sense. If you could wave a magic wand, sure. But practically speaking, I don't quite see it working. But, talk to me in 6 months or a year. Maybe I'll change my mind.
One last question on the idea of liability, that software developers need to accept some responsibility for the systems they release. Some of the angriest people I encounter in this debate are the advocates of open source, and they say, how dare you put restrictions on us? We are the fount of innovation. We are the ones who are creating incredible things. We are not going to accept your legal systems forcing us to pay money for what we do. How do you address the question of openness and decentralization in this world in which arguably there should be, as you say, more liability, more verifiability, and so on?
I guess I would say a couple things. First, to reassure some people, it's not limiting open source of everything. It's for a certain type of frontier, highly capable model that people are most concerned about. In my loose community, we'll say of AI safety people, when people are concerned about open source, it's not for everything. They're happily open source about numerous other technologies in numerous other ways, but almost no one thinks open sourcing nuclear weapons capabilities or ability to develop them is a good idea. And there are just some things that, in my opinion, it's better to err on the side of caution, similar with advanced bioweapons and these sorts of things. So why don't we just take a beat, take a step in a way, and think about how these systems are developing? We're still trying to get a handle on it. And over the next several years, let's be more cautious. I really think it is better to be prepared than to be underprepared, and we don't want to be caught off guard. Now, some people might think this ruins innovation. I don't think it does. We're going to see open source, I think it's only lagging behind by 6 to 12 months as it is. So it's not like it's all or nothing. I just think at the very frontier, we are still trying to figure things out, and it's too much of a risk and too much of a danger to keep going forward and have it open to everyone.
In any case, we do want innovation, but we want innovation in AI safety. We want innovation in the interpretability of AI systems. We want innovation in how AI systems can be monitored for power-seeking behaviors.
Oh, quite, yes. If we're thinking about AI safety research, yes, more openness, more collaboration, the better. Unless, of course, you need to have secret access to some of these systems. Yeah, there are numerous ways that humanity can come together using open source models while still restricting the very powerful models themselves. I believe Dario Amodei, again of Anthropic, is using kind of a need-to-know principle. So even within the organization, within the company, not everyone knows everything about the models or even the strategy because he thinks it's too dangerous. It's like, well, okay, you have one of the smarter humans on Earth trying to develop very, very powerful models, and he thinks it's too much of a risk to even let people in the company know everything that's going on. I think that should give us all pause.
Any final remarks? Anything you think our listeners should have in mind as they step away from this podcast episode?
Well, depending on who you are, this can be a lot to take in. Take your time with it to sit through some of the arguments. Humanity has done wonderful things before. Yes, also terrible things, but wonderful things. So I think we can come together and sort all this out, but it won't happen by default. We have to be engaged. We have to understand and learn more. And hopefully people will come to see the book as useful in that regard and other podcasts like this.
Thanks very much for your time, Darren.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Darren. That was fun.